From the Grand Reading Room in the Nashville Public Library, this is Just Conversations, Nashville Reads How to Be an Antiracist, presented by the Metro Human Relations Commission.
Good afternoon. My name is Melissa Hudson-Gant, and I serve as the Chief Executive Officer of Big Brothers Big Sisters of Middle Tennessee. Welcome to Just Conversations Nashville, where we are reading How to Be an Anti-Racist and discussing our thoughts about the different chapters that we have read. And I have several nonprofit leaders joining me today, and I'm going to let each person introduce themselves. Kaki?
Yeah, I'm Kaki Friskics-Warren. I work with the Maddox Fund and appreciate the work that Ibram X. Kendi did on how to be an anti-racist. I also appreciated his earlier book, Stamped from the Beginning, The History of Racism in the United States, and commend it to people as well.
And Amna?
Hi, my name is Amna Osman. I'm CEO at Nashville Cares. It's such a pleasure to be here to have this really important conversation. It's a critical and important conversation, especially during this time in our country. So it's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ingrid?
Hi, I'm Ingrid Cockhren. I am a local collective impact leader that's focused on trauma. And I'm very excited to be here. I'm very excited to talk about this topic today.
And I thank all of you for joining today to have this most important conversation. And we're here to discuss Chapter 8 in the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And this chapter distinguishes between racist and anti-racist behavior. And I thought, just for our audience and kind of to ground our discussion, that I would share with you the definition. So that we all have some shared understanding. So behavioral racist is one who is making individuals responsible for the perceived behavior of racial groups and making racial groups responsible for the behavior of individuals. And a behavioral anti-racist, one who is making racial group behavior fictional and individual behavior real, which is really thought-provoking for me in the way that I think about a lot of things. So I'm interested in your thoughts on behavioral racism and anti-racism. Ingrid, do you want to start and maybe share how you responded when you read this and thought about it?
Sure. I think that our understanding of racism really needs to be expanded. So right now when we think of racism, we think of individual one-on-one interactions, whereas racism is systemic and is on several layers of the way that we interact with the world. So I think that it's great to take some time to think about what is the behavior of racism, what does it mean to be anti-racist, and ultimately what we're talking about is understanding that when we talk about large groups, it cannot be just those one-on-one interactions. It can't be just one individual's behavior or our perception of the behavior of a group, because when we get to group level interactions, racism is really about policies and also these microsystem attributes like our values, our beliefs, which are deeply entrenched in the way that we were raised, our American values, the environments that we live in, which have absolutely nothing to do with skin color. But because we live in a racist society, we have attached attributes and behaviors to skin color for many different reasons: survival, obviously racism, feelings of superiority, and ultimately social and political gain. And so I think it's great to be able to really analyze racism on several different layers: behavior, policy, attitudes, beliefs, not just the covert racism or overt racism that we are used to when we think about this topic.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, I think, the relationship between values and policy and how policy drives behavior, which drives values. It's a cycle, and where do you start to unpack? Aman, what about you? What are some of your thoughts?
So I think what really resonated to me is when you start thinking about individuals responsible for perceived behavior of racial groups and making racial groups responsible for the behavior of individuals. I think those are really those are really racist ways when we start to think of a behavior of an individual and how it impacts a group and a group and how they impact an individual. And I think being a black woman and having really experienced how, times, I think when Kendi talked about, how he felt of the pressure of feeling that you represent an entire community, it weighs really hard on you, and you kind of really start to feel that, especially when your peers and colleagues say to you, you're the poster child working in, an institution or an establishment, that you're the only black person or very few black people. It's really challenging, and you start to feel like you can't make mistakes, and your failures and what you do are really scrutinized and watched very closely, and that even if you are performing, you have to perform and work even harder. It really is a burden on a person of color, and especially a black person, to feel that way all the time, and that kind of really perpetuates all of the other issues that are in the system. To your point, the policies that are racist, the systems that are racist. So it really puts a lot of burden on people, and the whole notion of individual behavior, black behavior, thinking of that folks that deviate or are not considered part of the norm because of the color of their skin, have these kinds of behaviors that are irresponsible. We all have irresponsible behavior regardless of our racial groups. So to really kind of put that notion on it, that really creates racist societies, racist interactions, and people that then start to believe that they are different because of the color of their skin. To me, that really resonated with me in this chapter, about how behavior really affects the way we deal, and you put that layer of racism on it, it even gets more profound.
And what you shared just made me think about how isolating that is, and how it disconnects us from each other.
Yeah. So I think I'm going to answer that question because I'm a preacher with a story instead of an explanation. A member of my congregation is a descendant of Gola community, and many of them are settled around South Carolina, Florida, speaking their own language, having their own traditions, and he has a great deal of pride in his community. And so when he's now working on a PhD in sociology, so when he came to town to do his research, he was staying at our place. And he came down and said, "Kaki, can I borrow your iron?" A seemingly innocent question. I don't have an iron. And out of that, we started pulling apart what is racism and what is racist behavior in that symbol of an iron. So I, as a white woman, don't iron because I shake my clothes out of the dryer and that's it, I'm going. If I have a wrinkled shirt, it does not reflect on all of white people. They don't say, oh, white people are trashy, this woman has on a wrinkled shirt. And it also doesn't, if I have on a wrinkled shirt, it doesn't set me up for being disrespected as a white woman, or possibly being the victim of violence. But my friend was taught that in all cases, wherever you go, you're representing your people. So you are going to iron the shirt that's going to be under your pullover sweater, in addition to ironing anything that might be on top of, that people would see. And we started thinking about that in terms of, he did that because his behavior might, for some people, reflect on his entire community, which he wants to lift up, but also because in his wrinkled shirt, it's that political respectability. If he didn't present himself, then he might be a victim of violence or disrespect, or he might go into a store and no one would wait on him. And so it was interesting for me how an iron, which talks about behavior, how do we attribute individual behavior to groups, or make the faulty, or he says fictitious assumption that a group has a shared behavior. We don't have shared, we learned that in our most recent election. Groups do not have monolithic behaviors or decision making.
Right.
So, stories.
And the weight and the consequences to what should be an inconsequential decision or behavior.
Exactly. I have an iron now for my guests.
Now you have an iron? Okay. So one of the things that Dr. Kendi discusses in this chapter is the history of standardized testing. So I'm interested to know if that history was new to you, was that information that you had, and if it was new or any of the information, did that change how you think about standardized testing, and if so, why? Amanda, you want to start?
So that was interesting. You know, I've been an educator in higher education, and just the, you know, looking at the system. I have two boys that have gone through K through 12 in America. I did not study here, so it was kind of interesting coming in to look at seeing how the inequalities that exist in our educational system and how we teach for the test. That's really how we've been prepared. It's really unfortunate. And when we think about that, the inequities that, you know, happen, I always say, you know, where you live matters and your zip code matters. Because based on where schools are, whether they're in cities or in suburbs, really affects the kind of education that you receive. Because all educators, you know, even in cities, we have great teachers, we have schools, the buildings are there, but the resources are not available. So really being able to then think about how even people process language, their lived experiences, you know, where they live, and trying to get a test that was actually developed by people who are from one, you know, group or one race, that think it's universal across the board. You know, young kids looking at whether they call, you know, a couch or a sofa. So thinking of those kinds of things, of how we really look at the inequalities and the disparities that these tests and how racist these policies are. I think our educational system is one of the most racist in the way that we are trying to educate folks. We're not preparing them to really have the good foundation and the building blocks to build up until they get to college. I mean, I teach students that have remedial math and English when they come from the 12th grade into college, and the time and effort that they spend really trying to get past those because the foundation is not there. And then they get to me where I teach human, you know, service and you know, political science, trying to really get them there. They're just broken. They're feeling frustrated. They're angry because of these inequities that we've created. So it's really important to really focus on how do you look at the learning of each child? How do you make sure that we're teaching them what is critical and important, and providing them what I call the tools, and giving, you know, what, and we'll talk later about it, the opportunities for children to thrive and to really advance. And so I think, I mean, the standardized testing, the way he talked about it in the book, I had never heard it laid out that way, to kind of take, I had heard about the bell curve and No Child Left Behind and, you know, and PISA, but all of that it was really interesting to see what we've done over time, thinking in good intentions that we were trying to really build a solid educational system, when we were really building policies and systems that were truly racist and really were not for all. And I think that was the big thing, that it just resonated with me and kind of really took me by surprise when you see it written that way. So.
It really gelled for me too, how we're defining intelligence and aptitude, and what a great consequence it is for us to have structured it in this way. Ingrid, your thoughts?
I was very familiar with the history of standardized testing and IQ testing. So this is something I also teach in higher ed. I teach at Tennessee State University, which is a historically black college or university, and my students, I try to cater my courses to them and their experiences. So they're mostly African American students, and I use the testing, the IQ testing and the intelligence testing in World War II as a way for them to understand if tests are valid or reliable. And so I use that as an example of a test that's not valid. So because it's not testing for what they want to test for. So if we're going to test for intelligence, then we have to have other factors, on an equal field, on an equal playing field before we can test for intelligence. So if we have a large group and we're testing everyone, then we have to account for socioeconomic status. We have to account for whatever their educational background is. And so if we put everybody in a bowl like soldiers and of all different races and all different backgrounds, during segregation, then we would then find that we are really not testing intelligence, we're testing those backgrounds, how those background factors are impacting the outcomes of those assessments. And so I use that one so that they can have a clear understanding of the information that they're getting in college, right? So I teach psychology courses. My students are coming from all different majors. So, some of them are definitely getting this information about the achievement gap, where they're understanding that the numbers don't look good based on their skin color. And so helping them to understand that, because especially those first, breakground studies like that one for the soldiers during World War II and others, that, if you are a researcher that has a racist worldview, then you are going to find information that supports your worldview. And if we are going to test for IQ without eliminating those background factors like income and environment, then we are just reinforcing our racist worldview, which was what those who did those first tests, like Benet, they had that racist worldview. They believed that white people were intellectually superior, and their beliefs weren't just picked from the sky. There's been a very clear, academic elitist attitude around race as far back as the 1700s. So in textbooks, European elites attributed, cultural and social and environmental factors to skin color and race, and made the concept of race and then told people that they were in a racial category. And of course, they decided that their race was the civilized race and that everyone else was on a different scale, with indigenous and Africans being what they called savage. And if we look at the social political context of the time, in the 1700s, there's active enslavement of Africans and there's active genocide of the indigenous people. And so it definitely fits the worldview to say that these groups are savage and are less than, because it supports my actions and my beliefs, in the world. I'm going to put myself as the most intellectual and the most superior, and then those that I'm actively taking advantage of, exploiting, then they're less than and would not be able to survive if it wasn't for me. And so this is, something that's not new. It's not that they're not at fault. People are not at fault for their racist views because they're in a racist system. And so now it's up to systems to change, to kind of make the changes. Now that we've done a great job of taking research and having it within that social political context. Like, now we understand that there's no such thing as a genetic race. Now we understand that before, when we thought about genetics, it's really epigenetics, which is how our DNA really interacts with our environment. So if our environment is hostile because of racism, then there's going to be what looks to be racial differences when it's really environmental differences. And I think that, I hope that we begin to examine these older landmark studies around lots of different things, not just intelligence, and examine it with this understanding that at the time we had a very aggressively racist worldview. And now that we know better, what does it mean to address this and to go back and be more equitable in our understanding of research in general?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's kind of unlearning. Yeah.
So I'm going to say yes and yes. And it was not new to me either that that intelligence tests were actually quite racially biased. So I'm not going to try to unpack it because y'all did such a great job of it. So I'm going to tell another story. My husband and I took custody of a young man when he was 14 who had come to the country without documentation from Guatemala with his mother. And when his mother died, it was the village decision, all of us with his extended family, that we would be the best people to take custody. One, because we were documented and we could go into juvenile court without fear, but also because we had health insurance. And with he in our custody, we could do health insurance. So he was definitely raised by the village. But when he went to take his ACT tests, he did extremely poorly, such that requiring him to take it multiple times or requiring him or asking him to go to these prep courses would have just been cruel. And I agree with you, Ingrid, they were testing his environment, not his intelligence. So when he graduated from high school, he went to a medical assistant program and went to work for a local nonprofit as a medical assistant. And when he was in school, he would send pictures of his, I made a 99 on this test, I made a 106 on this test. And he got to the nonprofit where he continues to work as a medical assistant. A couple of years later, there was an opening for an insurance navigator. So someone who helped people say, are you eligible for TennCare, disability? And so he was working with folks in that regard. And then about 3 months ago, there was a clinic director position that opened up. And he was the successful candidate for that clinic director. He's 25. He is the youngest clinical director they have ever had. Those tests had nothing to do with his intelligence. They had everything to do with his environment. That's a good way to say it, but his history, his language barriers, his trauma of losing his mother. That was not an accurate reflection of this man's intelligence and abilities.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Which I think brings us around to the next thing for us to talk about. I was really struck by the difference between an achievement gap, rephrasing that to an opportunity gap, which I suspect that we all recognize. What were some of your thoughts around that?
So we definitely don't have an achievement gap, we have an opportunity gap. When you think about the opportunities that young folks have as it relates to where they go to school, it varies. There's huge disparities. I mean, city schools, when you think about how many swimming pools, when kids say, I don't know how to swim, they didn't have that opportunity to learn swimming. Chess club, opportunities to intern. You'll have a child who's from the suburbs that said, well, I took an internship or I went to a study abroad at a corporation or in Paris, where a kid from the city, the opportunities are not equitable. And so, you're gonna go to your church, you're gonna go into a corporation for an internship, you don't have an opportunity to kind of see outside your world and where you live to kind of broaden your sphere and experiences. So you get to move in life and your scope is very narrow. And so it's not about achievement. It's because we're teaching for a test, but if we told every educator, forget about the test, would we have different students? Would we see the abilities differ, not by the color of your skin, of how children would achieve and advance? It is about your opportunity, and the other thing is, your access, and poverty, other social determinants play a huge role, including racism. We don't like to call it that. Racism plays a significant role in racist policies and how our educational system is set up to, not give everybody the opportunities that they deserve to thrive and to be able to have good education from the foundation all the way up. And so until we do that, I think achievement gaps and all that stuff we're talking about, investing time and resources, is not going to get us to where we want to go, because all good intended folks, including presidents, have tried to do educational reform. Why are we still, in this day and age in 2020, don't have equitable education and advancements from an opportunity perspective for every student, regardless of the color of their skin? We need to ask ourselves that question. So it's not to say we haven't thought about it, and resources matter, money matters where we put it, technology, opportunities of access. Look at just what's happening now with the COVID pandemic. Students have to stay at home and they have to learn through a virtual platform. How many children have access to computers or have ever been on a virtual platform? I mean, we all work for nonprofits, and we can talk about this later. The amount of barriers that people experience to access services because they don't know how to use these virtual platforms. They've never been taught, they've never been exposed to them, they've never had the opportunity. But the kids from the suburbs who went to, they're all sitting there, they know how to get on, they know how to access all these different learning tools, online. So it's a real problem, and it's a concern when we start to think about it. If we were so far behind from an opportunity perspective prior to COVID pandemic, what are we going to do thinking moving forward at this point, where we even have more barriers and more issues that are going on because of now technology is critical in order for you to advance educationally. Mm-hmm. And not everybody has that opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Ingrid, do you think that shifting our focus from an achievement gap to an opportunity gap can create avenues for us to create anti-racist policies?
I think it's possible. I'm a bit of a pessimist when it comes to real change, because real change does require equity. And I think at this point, we should be fairly secure in our understanding that America is not big on equity. Even the push, or the way we conceptualize racism in general, is built on equality, right? And that's great. You know, it's good if everyone was treated the same and everybody had the same opportunities. That would be awesome. But that's not what we have, and that's not what we've ever had. And there has been no real push to make that happen, because every time we get to the point of equity, right, when it comes up, when we have opportunities to put it into place, there's a pushback. And it's a very real pushback. It is mostly around funding, and it is mostly around those who have funding and power, saying, no, we need equality. We can't give more to this group, right? Even though we have traditionally taken more from this group, and we have long underinvested in this group. And what would we expect there? We can't expect there to be any differences around the gaps that we have always had in this country if we're not willing to do anything different. And we are not, at this point, willing to do anything different. We're not willing to put our money where our mouth is. And even when we do, it's not fully actualized, because we don't want to admit that we're racist. So we come up with great interventions that are very much research-based and evidence-based. And then we take these interventions, and it's time to implement them with real people in the real world, not the white college students that the interventions were done on in the first place. When it's in the real world and we're trying to close these gaps, that's when we hit on the fact that there's teacher bias, that those that came up with the interventions were biased, and that we are not really willing at this point to make equity a real thing. And also, it would make a shift in our understanding of where the problems lie. We are focused on fixing the families, fixing the children, right? We're thinking we need to be strength-based with families, and we need to push for ways that families can change their habits. And so we are thinking, we're going to be, strength-focused with families, but we're not deficit-focused with our systems. Our systems are the problem. Not those individuals, not the families. Our systems need to be revamped, and we are very much clinging to our systems.
Mm-hmm. We're all represent the nonprofit community that's part of this gathering and this discussion, and whether intentionally or unwittingly, I think many of us in the nonprofit community or organizations and the ways in which we operate and serve our community have been operating with racist structures and policies. And I'm interested to know how you think the nonprofit community can switch from an achievement gap focus to an opportunity gap focus, and how is it that we should be driving change? How is it that we can work on ourselves?
Yeah, I think that each nonprofit is at a perfect time to be asking those exact questions. And it spans everything. It's how do we make job announcements? How do we list job requirements? How do we disclose salary ranges? All of those things either create opportunity or they keep the current system locked in place. Same thing as with board members. We recently rewrote our board descriptions to talk about life experience. It's not just what is your profession, but what is your life experience that you can bring to this board. And I certainly know that's true when you're choosing staff members as well. And then it really is like the easy part in the nonprofit sector is to look at policies and practices. Really, the harder thing is changing culture, and I think that requires intentionality, determination. And I think leaders having a support system so that they will keep moving forward. it is, the time is right now to be making those moves, and it needs to be a commitment for the long haul.
Mm-hmm. And I know the Maddox Fund has done a lot of work to give that support.
We're still a work in progress, really. And this year what we're doing is just an equity justice audit of our practices. And I will have to look at the fact that since I'm the founding director, all the practices that are in place are ones that I put in place. The racist structures that are there are ones that I helped put there. And so now it's about dismantling it and building liberating systems to take their place.
Mm-hmm. Aman, any thoughts about the nonprofit community?
Yeah, I think I commend you for really talking about, the system and the policies that really perpetuate racism within the walls of our nonprofits. You're absolutely right. We have to move to anti-racist organizations and really want to do the work, and this is the time, and you're absolutely right. As leaders, we have to really focus on ourselves first and see how are we perpetuating those policies, how are we the ones incorporating those policies or even creating those policies. And from an equity standpoint, from the hiring, from mentoring and coaching our staff to really building them, from recruiting board members, from looking at do we mirror the populations and the communities that we serve, and if we don't, let's have a really honest and authentic conversation. Are the programs that we're offering in the communities even, the right programs, and are they benefiting our communities? Because we also, we talk about the achievement gap with students. We have funders. We do what the funders ask us. I say it's a prescribed racist policies that we put in place so we can be able to cater to the funders and what they want us to do, but are we really moving the needle and really helping the people that we're serving by what we're doing, and really assessing and pushing back and saying this is not working for our communities because of these reasons, because we've taken the time to dismantle racism, to talk about what are the barriers, and to say to the funders this is what needs to happen because we've done this work. If we can do that collectively, then to your point, we can start to change the systems and the institutions. But until then, we're perpetuating the same thing. So I think it's a really great time for us to really, as nonprofits, step back and really assess. I mean, this is one way to have these conversations. Mm-hmm. We need to come together, and we need to have what I call the courageous conversations together to really understand what is happening and how are we showing up, and what are we doing as leaders to really work on ourselves, to move ourselves from racist spaces to anti-racist spaces, and to have conversations about what we bring to the table. And I think until we do that, we're going to continue just in kind of what I call the vicious cycle. But there's hope and there's positivity. This is, a time that we have had more conversations about race and really called it what it is than we have ever had. And so I really commend us for coming together. And I think as nonprofits, because we serve people who are marginalized, who have a lot of needs, and it's about servant leadership. We hear them, we trust them, we meet them where they're at, we start to get to know them. See, that's the other thing, getting to know where people are, what their experiences are. So I think it's really, we are more equipped than I think any sector at this time to really come together and to have these critical, important conversations. And we have them across funders, different sectors of what we provide as nonprofits, and to not look at ourselves as competitors, but to look ourselves as community, groups and bodies that really want to create the change and want to leave an anti-racist space so we can make it better for the people that we serve. And I think we're on the road to that, but there's a lot of work to do. And to your point, we have to really be honest and ready to, experience what will illuminate as we start to peel that onion and to find out what really is going on in our institutions. Mm-hmm. So the time is now.
Ingrid, I know you said that you are a pessimist, but do you feel that there's hope?
Well, I think there's always hope. Obviously we've made a lot of gains as a country. So there's hope. It's slow, but there have been gains. And I think that nonprofits really need to start rethinking their role. And so a lot of it is about charity, right? And I think that that's great. Charity is wonderful. I'm not saying that that's not the way to go. But when we think about us as a system, we really need to think about the fact that we owe Black people and Indigenous people, our country, our systems, we owe them. We owe them money, we owe them reparations. It is our duty to rebuild these communities because these systems are the reason why they're in this state. There is fault, there is blame, there is a source, there is root causes. So then you need to be in the space where it's not that I'm being charitable or that I'm helping someone out. It's that I am righting past wrongs, that I have to do this because of the debt that I owe. And until we get to that point where we really see this as a debt that's owed, and we're not a country that's great with our debts. And so this is all a part of our identity. All of this is a part of our identity. We are a part of the system. We need to see the system for what it is, and we need to pay our debts.
Mm-hmm. That's really powerful. And actually, I think the nonprofit community plays a unique role. We are, and from my perspective, kind of the glue that brings together a lot of different communities. We have our government, we have our corporate community, we have our faith-based communities all kind of coalesce around the nonprofit sector. And as leaders, we do have a mandate to bring people together to have these important discussions and talk about how is it that we are paying the debt that we owe to our fellow citizens, and how is it that we're creating the community that creates opportunity and addresses the opportunity gap for our citizens that have barriers through, because of these racist systems that we have created and in great part have been perpetuating.
Right. I love, Ingrid, how you talked about the word charity, which keeps white supremacy locked into place using that word. And so many people are talking about how do we move charity from the center and put justice in the center. It's a very different way of looking at fundraising and what kind of racist patterns we fall into in our fundraising practices, but it also challenges people who are making gifts to say, is this a charity, or is this a charitable thing I'm doing, or am I promoting justice and new policies, procedures, practices that advance people? And that's where the opportunity gap is closed, is with justice, not with charity.
Yeah. Well, thank you all so much again for joining us for this really important conversation. For more information and for more episodes, you can go to www.justconversations.org. Thank you for joining us.